Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. My guest today was Sara DiNatale. Sara is the energy reporter for the San Antonio Express News, where she's been since 2023. She previously covered issues in Florida at the Tampa Bay Times. She's a great writer covering a wide variety of energy issues. If you aren't following her on Twitter or following her stories at the Express News, I highly encourage you to do so. There are links for where to find her in the show notes. What prompted this conversation was an extraordinary 4-part series she did on the practices of some solar companies that were acting completely unethically and taking advantage of customers in Texas. The series is really, really well done. It was very eye-opening for me. I had been hearing stories and anecdotes similar to what she covers in her series, but nothing like what she put together in those extraordinary 4 pieces. I highly recommend you read it and share it, particularly with folks that are considering solar. And look, I do encourage folks to adopt solar technology, to get it at their homes and businesses, but you need to be an informed consumer. There are bad companies out there, and you need to know what to look for. Sara's amazing work of investigative journalism is a great place to start. By the way, since we recorded, there is a bill filed at the legislature by Senator Zaffirini that deals with a lot of the problems in Sara's series. We will put a link to that in the show notes as well. We weren't able to talk about it when we recorded because it hadn't been filed yet. And with that, I hope you enjoy the podcast. As always, please like, rate, and review the Energy Capital Podcast wherever you listen. And thank you for listening. Sara DiNatale, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thanks for having me today.
Just can't say enough great things about the 4-part series you wrote on residential solar in Texas. This is definitely something that has been bubbling as a problem for a long time, but really just hasn't had a spotlight put onto it. And you definitely put that spotlight. Deeply appreciative of the investigative reporting and journalism there. Can you describe for the audience the 4-part series, kind of how you came to be interested in that and came to do it, and kind of what you learned in the process of writing it?
Yeah, of course. So obviously 4 parts, there's a lot of material there, but it started as hearing about one company that had left some folks with systems that weren't working, and I found out they were still paying monthly loan payments on a system that wasn't providing energy. But what turned into sort of a close look at a local company made me realize that there was a much bigger problem, that it wasn't just, one company, but a trend among some of these companies. By no means are all solar companies this irresponsible or leaving people with non-working systems or holes in their roofs, but there was a significant chunk of folks that were really left in horrible situations, who probably should have never been sold a solar system to begin with. Their homes just weren't good candidates. And it kind of was like peeling back an onion. I found out one thing and then realized that there was another issue. I'm a relatively new Texan, so I didn't know that, you didn't need a license to install solar panels beyond doing it under the supervision of an electrician. And I remember the first time I learned that, I was like, oh, wait, and then came to learn that means the folks often on roofs bolting panels into place don't have training and don't have the know-how. The folks designing the system, they also aren't required to have any licensure. So you have a lot of folks that kind of looked at this as a cash grab, who got into it after Uri tested the grid and put a lot of folks on edge and worried about not having enough power. It made them all the more eager to be interested in solar. That sort of timed with the pandemic, where you had a lot of folks working from home who were more likely to run into these door-to-door salespeople and were already more likely to do home renovations during that time. It sort of just created this perfect mix of things that really brought an uptick of solar to Texas. But in that expansion, we also found a lot of bad actors who just give the whole industry a bad name.
Yeah, and some of there's both a lot of great stats in there and a lot of stories, and obviously we want to talk a lot about the stories. But just to give one of the stats, and we don't know statewide because the data collection is a little spotty and uneven. But we know from Austin and San Antonio that this is not a small problem. That I believe one of the cities was 18% and another was 24% of installations did not receive the. Well, can you describe that? What did they not get? They didn't get their approval to interconnect to the grid, right? Is that what it was?
Yeah. So if you're adding solar panels to your home, same or batteries or both, you need either a city or utility inspector, just depending on how your municipality is set up, to come to your home and basically say like, yeah, you're good to connect to the grid. Like this meets whatever local building codes we may have, or is just like soundly installed and, isn't going to like knock power out of the street if it like isn't connected improperly. And so that percentage range you mentioned was people whose inspections failed that a first visit, and that means that chunk of folks were not able to connect to the grid. So not only were they not benefiting from their system, but the grid as a whole was not benefiting from their system. There was no, it was useless. I think I had one source call them like roof decorations, like really expensive roof decor. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but we found that in Austin, they even found like on second and third inspection, some of these systems were still failing. So those are systems that aren't useful for anyone, aren't helping the grid, aren't helping the consumer. And in a lot of cases, they're still on the hook for monthly loan payments.
Yeah, you have in one of the stories, you tell the story of Andrew Cates, who had this exact problem where the system was done and he had paid the installer, but it wasn't yet approved for interconnection to the grid. And he actually, can you tell his story? Like what actually happened there? Yeah.
One of the, I think Andrew's also a great example because he's not the stereotypical victim that a lot of people assume. Like he isn't an older guy. He wasn't like, didn't feel like he was bamboozled. He'd done research, like got bids from multiple companies. But just because there aren't any safeguards in Texas, he was presented after the panels were installed on his roof. He was presented with a paper to sign that said like, okay, your panels are done. And, the technicians who installed it asked him to sign it. He signed it, didn't really think much of it because, it seemed like just normal paperwork. Well, that was considered a certificate of completion. And that's actually what the installer shows to the bank or lender in this case to get the funds released. So he signed off, they get the fund release, and now he can't get them back on the phone. And his system isn't passing inspection. So he's not actually able to use it. Austin Energy is telling him, this and this is wrong. This is on, I don't know how much, I can't remember now how much I detailed in the story, but I think he told me like some of his, transmission stuff was like upside down and just stuff was like, really poorly done. Like someone who had done it clearly was not really familiar with what they were doing. And he wasn't, he says, he was fortunate that he could afford the monthly payments. He wasn't in like financial strait, but he could very easily see how someone could be. And he was like very much worried about like, oh my gosh, this happened to me. How are some other people who don't have as much, wherewithal or ability to research or, know who to call? What are they supposed to do? And he wound up actually testifying last session about his experience because he was so worried about how this all played out. And the legislation he testified on behalf would require that the certificate of completion like be signed by the inspecting body so that like you can't get the system, they can't get paid until the system is operating or get the rest of the funds released. Usually there's a small amount of the funds that are released, and then that sort of covers the supply costs, and then the lender holds on to the rest. That would be like the profit. And what lawmakers last session sort of floated was this idea of like, okay, let's make the actual inspectors be the ones to sign off on the certificate of completion. That kind of would help safeguard and hold the installers a little more accountable in the process.
Yeah, you talked about that in the articles, and that really struck me as one of the most obvious legislative fixes to this problem for folks that are listening. Look, I don't think, certainly I don't, you can speak for yourself. I wouldn't want anybody's takeaway to be, well, you shouldn't ever get solar. The question at this point, though, folks should read your series before going to get bids and considering solar. And if they do move forward, and I hope people do, that is one thing you can do on your own, is say, I'm not signing a certificate of completion until the inspection passes. Now, obviously, I hope everybody reads your articles, but probably not everybody in Texas is going to read them. So
Sure.
It would make sense, probably, at least in my view, to put that into law. I want to ask you, you could comment on any of that you want, but I want to hear some of the other stories. You tell a lot of stories through the articles, but maybe you can just share another one, because I want folks to really kind of understand the predicament people were put into by some of these companies, and then we'll get to some of the companies themselves and kind of their sales culture, which is just, obviously abhorrent. But tell another story of a
Sure.
of a homeowner who was victimized.
Yeah. One of the families that will stay with me probably forever. Like they welcomed me into their home, and I befriended their Chihuahua, the Duncan family in Corpus Christi. So the mother and father in the family, elderly, both are hearing impaired, both speak primarily through sign language and have their whole lives. So their daughter is hearing, but she still primarily communicates in sign language because that's what she grew up around. Lower income family on disability. The mom is sick, and dealing with a bunch of different ailments. Her husband is a semi-retired mechanic, but he has arthritis in his wrist, so there's only so much work he's able to do. And the daughter is really like the full-time caregiver for her mom, and while balancing 3 jobs, and really, they're just trying to make things work. So a door-to-door salesman knocks on their door and kind of sells them on this dream that, in hindsight, they can say sounded too good to be true. But in the moment, he said, oh, I have another, a neighbor, over there, they have solar now, and they're saving so much money that on their electric bills that they can cover more of their medical bills. And, you guys are going to qualify for a government program, and you're going to get the panels for free, and it's going to make your lives so much easier. And the daughter, and Jessica, who was kind of put in the middle of this situation, was like, we'd really like an interpreter, kind of brushes her off, they create these high pressure scenarios that are like, if you don't act now, you're going to lose out on this. I'm leaving town soon, and I really don't want you to miss out on this free government program. There's no free government program, like that doesn't exist. Sometimes sales folks will manipulate the truth of like some tax credits you can get to make it just the way they twist what is actual versus what is real, what they're saying. It's just, it gets really confusing for folks. They wound up with more panels than could ever make sense. Both sides of their roof are covered. They have 2 separate loans. There's worth $100,000. There's some discrepancy over the second loan. They say they never even signed the paperwork for it. The companies involved, obviously, have a little bit of a different take of how things have played out. But anyone with eyeballs could go to their home and just say, hey, this isn't a great candidate for solar. They have a really old air conditioning unit. They don't have the greatest insulation. If you truly wanted to lower their energy bills, there are so many other things to do before jumping right to solar. Like, it would have made way more sense to finance a new AC unit, for example, than it would have to finance this whole new solar system for them. So they're now, this is a family that doesn't have a lot of income, that now has is defaulting on loans, has destroyed their credit scores, and they really don't know what to do. They're really stuck because they have a system that doesn't work and that they can't afford. And the business that installed it no longer exists.
It's really devastating. And again, the the series is full of some of these stories, but I think part of the story as well are the companies that are preying on these folks. And again, I'll just say it again, and I hope you'll add to this. This is not every solar company out there. Want to be very clear about that.
Sure.
But it is very important that folks understand there are companies out there that are doing some of these things. Can you describe some of the sales culture and maybe some of the worst offenders?
Yeah, and I think by doing that, it'll also help folks understand red flags, because sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish who's honest and who's not, right? So generally speaking, the companies that rely on door-to-door sales tactics should make most people just like, be careful, be more careful. I have some folks who advise, like some experts say, don't buy anything from a door-to-door salesperson ever. I can't speak to every installation ever. I'm sure there's some folks out there that bought from a door-to-door salesman and had a good experience. But a lot of the people I spoke to who had bad experiences, almost every single one of them, it started with that meeting at the front door. So we know from, I obtained videos of some of training sessions from some folks. It was a outfit out in Dallas Fort Worth that was really prevalent and strategic in how they door knocked. So they recruit typically younger folks. A lot of times it's like men in their early 20s. And they kind of tell them like, stick with me, bud, you're going to be a millionaire. Just trust me. And they knock on hundreds of doors, at least 100 a day sometimes, just like crazy numbers. And they ask for your energy bill. They're looking for folks who are elderly a lot. There's like literal, and as you saw in the story of a guy being like, look for the Buicks and the Oldsmobile and the trinkets in the front lawn. That's probably an older person, and they might not have a lot of disposable income, but their credit is good, and the credit's going to pass, and they're going to get the loan, so you're going to get your payout. Also, old people a lot of times are, kind of starved for conversation, and they definitely say like, oh yeah, be patient, sit down, talk to them like they're your grandparent. There's a saying used called kneel for the deal, which is like so literal. It's not like a figure of speech. They're literally kneeling down to grandpa in the recliner with, these really oversimplified slides that are like, you'll save this much, your energy bills will be $0 and we're going to change your life and you're going to get all this money back from the government. And they move fast, they talk fast, but at the same time, they do a really good job earning the trust of folks. And they've really perfected this pitch to get people sort of interested. And, they want you to basically sign on the tablet, get the loan, and then they're on to the next house. And that's sort of how they operate, just like really, really quickly. And some of them obscure the truth while others straight up just lie.
Yeah, I for one would highly recommend that everybody tell everybody in their family and their friends, if they're considering solar, do not buy from door to door. You don't have to say that. That's just my view of the world. I would also ask the company that you're talking to if there are commission sales. Can you talk a little bit about the dealer fees? Because that figures very prominently into your stories as how the price is so inflated from a lot of these dealer fees.
Yeah, so it's now obviously every house is different, how much energy you use, this is going to factor, but you're talking about on average, the average home system before financing should be somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000. And usually it's around 15 panels. So if you're getting a quote that's like 30 panels, like right away you should be like, what?
Unless you're in like a 5,000 square foot house,
sure,
right?
But
if average
you have
house,
a large home and large energy use, obviously there's different factors, but at least that that's the average, and you can say, why am I so above the average? And maybe they'll have a good answer. But it should at least make you pause and assess before you sign anything.
Yeah.
But when you finance a system, a lot of this growth was driven by the fintech industry. So these lenders are using AI to basically process applications super quickly. So you're essentially being shown a contract on an iPad, tapping on DocuSign, and being approved for large financing amounts very quickly in a way that a lot of folks are not conceptually used to, because they're used to like going to a bank and having, someone go through their finances. And it's a more, anyone who's bought a home, can understand like it's a long process. So folks sometimes just don't realize that what they're agreeing to is even like this huge financial agreement. So a lot of the times the way the financial agreements draw people in is they show a really low interest rate. So a few years ago, it was like interest rates as low as like 1%. Now they're a little more like 3, 4, the market's changed. And if you have bought a car recently as well, you know that like the best interest rate you're going to get for an automobile, for example, is like 7.25. And that's like, the best situation. So when people see this low interest rate, they're like, oh, how could I say no? This is such a great deal. Well, what is often not explained to folks, what we found, is that the lender is essentially buying down the interest rate with something called a dealer fee. Now, dealer fees in themselves aren't inherently bad. The issue we found is that there is a lack of transparency. So if you are buying down your interest rate, you should know that that's what you're doing. And if you do the math, sometimes it can make sense. Sometimes the paying to buy down your interest rate spread out over the monthly payments can technically come in a little lower than what it would be if you were being charged, 7-10% right up front. But that's often not, the math often does not make any sense. And especially when you're dealing with customers who, may have a higher interest rate if they were doing traditional lending because of like their spending history, credit score, etc. It just like they're obscuring reality a lot with these dealer fees. And people don't realize that that's what is being tacked on to their financing. And that's often why you see like loans from $80,000, $100,000 for systems that like should in theory have only costed 20 or 30. And then there's also cases where systems are just straight up oversized, where folks just like the salesman just sold as many panels as they could physically fit on the roof. So it's a mixed bag. But if you're getting like a large dollar figure that is above 25,000, I would definitely at least take pause and get other quotes and make sure that you understand exactly your financing. You can ask if there's a dealer fee. It doesn't always mean that they'll tell you, but most of the more ethical companies I interviewed are folks who like basically like welcomed me into their companies and said, we have nothing to hide, come hang out with us. They typically prefer using credit unions. You can also finance a system with your mortgage. Obviously, you should do that responsibly because then you could lose your house if you didn't make payments. So like, be a smart borrower. But there are other options, and there are ways to finance it that aren't predatory.
Yeah, and then the commissions are a big part of this too, right? There were some really just ridiculous commissions that weren't really being disclosed, and then were rolled into the price.
And it's so hard for me to even tell you what some of these commissions were. I think we quoted some figures of some, like, I think it was from a like one of the sales, like there's all these like it's kind of like MLMs. Like there's this whole like recruiting, like come sell for me and I'll teach you how to sell and take my course on how to sell. So
multi-level
part of like
marketing, that's what MLM. Yeah.
So as part of like to get recruits to come knock on doors, we found, I think it was a blog that was like, we've found that some commissions pay out 20%. And a lot of these folks, when you're doing door-to-door sales, especially, a lot of them are independent contractors, so they're not working for the company directly. So obviously they have a different incentive to sell you a system than someone who is earning a salary and maybe has like a reasonable commission, like, 1 to 3%, versus someone who's like giving themselves a huge pay bump. And there's just not very rarely is there any like a full disclosure, like itemized receipt that that gives anyone any idea. And sometimes when I was looking at these contracts, it was hard to know if it was the dealer fee that hiked up their cost, or if it was the person giving themselves a huge commission, or if it was both.
Right.
But like both of those things could play out independently or with each other. And that like created just some like really crazy net costs, but that by the end of the loan, people were paying like, what more than half their home was worth in and of itself.
Yeah. And speaking of that, like, a lot of these situations are folks in a $200,000 home on a fixed income. They're really struggling. And so a lot of times what these salespeople were doing, as you detail in the article, was taking some of that commission and actually giving people cash on site.
Yeah.
Like, if you sign up today, here's $500 in cash, which for a lot of people, that makes a big difference, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of tactics being deployed. And that's why sometimes some of these people earn trust seemingly to an outsider. It's like, how did you trust them? And it's like, well, he got me a new washing machine and my washing machine was broken. And, they aren't seeing the full picture of like, that money is coming out of the loan you're agreeing to. That
right.
is
you paid for
stretching
it,
on
not
for
them.
25, 30
Yep.
years.
Yep.
But, they're so, sometimes, there's one woman in the series who was going through severe anemia while all of this was happening and now can reflect and be like, I obviously was not in my right mind. And like, I was pretty transparent with the salesperson that I was not feeling well. And, I was dealing with a lot and he showed up so often and like, I couldn't even remember what I agreed to or what I didn't agree to. And, it's just, it boggles the mind that some of these folks wind up in these situations because it's like just takes such a dishonest person to pick them out and say, okay, this is who I'm going to sell to today. And, people will just wind up in really tough spots.
So I also want to ask you, like, how you came to find these folks. So you did a whole lot of digging, reviewed, 1,000 complaints?
Oh, yes. I should have mentioned this right up at the top. So a lot of the base of the story, like when you see all those figures and what sort of guided all 4 parts, was a huge database that we made. So that first company I mentioned, they're highlighted in the part 1, they're called Alternative Solar. I'd originally went to the Attorney General's office and requested complaints just about them to get a sense of like, what am I dealing with? Then I realized that I could get all the complaints. So I put in a big records request and I picked, I think it wound up being like a 16-month period. And I asked for all the solar related complaints filed by consumers in Texas. And we got back, I think, 1,113 or some. If I'm off, it's only by a few. And then I read each individual complaint summary, and then I put them in my own categorization system. So did this leaky roof, dishonest salesperson. I picked up these trends that were happening and I sorted them myself. The AG's office does some of its own sorting, but I wanted to be confident in what I had, so I made sure I sorted them. I read each individual complaint, and then I vetted out ones that were just like silly. Some people complain about dumb stuff, like, so the ones that were in our data set of about 900, those were all like very thorough complaints or very specific. They clearly had grounds of what they were complaining about. A lot of them provided documentation, and that was like sort of the data set that built us to realize how many people were with systems that didn't work, how many people had damage to their roofs. In the first series, we go to one of those people's homes. She actually had 2 massive holes in her ceiling because her panels were installed so poorly. And that company went out of business and she was kind of just left with a mess. So the consumer complaints to the Attorney General were a trove of information, and it really kind of speaking to your point earlier of how like we kind of knew this was an issue, but how much of an issue, it really showed the depth of the problem. And that's only the people who took the time to file a complaint, right? Like there's plenty of people who are just like living with the consequences and don't want to bother going through the paperwork, and saw from talking to other people who filed complaints that they never heard back from the Attorney General. So like why go through the motions of doing it if it's not going to lead to anything?
So many questions I want to ask you. Again, folks should read the articles because there's so much more detail in there. I do want to make sure though we have time to talk about some of the good folks because there are some.
Yeah.
This is obviously like it's very important people understand what's going on out there and how bad some of this is. There are some good guys and gals out there too. Can you talk about some of them? I believe his name was Craig Overmiller, who is training folks in San Antonio and giving them training by actually fixing some of the bad systems. You talked about the Capichis. Yeah, talk about some of the good actors out there.
Yeah, Craig is great and was also just a great resource for me through the whole project. I've shadowed a bunch of his classes. So you can get, we talked earlier about how not licenses aren't required. That doesn't mean you can't get proper certification. It's just that Texas isn't making people do it. Other states do. And that is some of the conversation I think that we'll hopefully see in session this year about what Texas could start doing to better regulate some of this stuff. So Craig teaches classes at St. Philip's Community College, and his students graduate knowing how to design, how to install, how to even ethically sell. Like they even have a sales part like unit that like he basically teaches them not to. Sounds crazy, but he teaches them not to rip people off because it like wildly needs to be said. And they, as part of their coursework, have found that there are so many people in need of their poorly installed systems to be repaired that like he has made a whole class out of it. Like the class is just like, I think it's called like problem solving or something. And they go out and they will provide free labor under the supervision of Craig and another like licensed electrician. And they troubleshoot a system for free. And they'll help you track down parts. The homeowners typically pay for the parts. There are also some local companies here in San Antonio. I'm sure there's other. These are just the ones, in our own backyard here. One is called Atma Energy, and the other is called Central Texas Solar. And both of them have done stuff to help people that have found themselves in this situation where, their systems aren't working and they're desperate for help, and they've, donated time, donated supplies, done what they can. I mean, both of those companies have said, like, we wish we could do more. Obviously, we have to pay our own employees and, like, be a sustainable business. So, like, they can't go out and just, like, fix people's stuff for free all the time. But they wish that there were more resources for the number of people in the community who are really, really stuck with these systems. And in some cases they have, we, in the last story, we highlight them helping someone locally who her system didn't work and she was under the impression it was working. So she stopped paying her CPS energy bill. So not only was she left with like crazy loans for a system that wasn't working, but she also wound up building up a backlog of CPS bills because the salesman told her she wouldn't have energy bills anymore. Which, as another red flag, will never be true. You will always have to pay the utility something, even if it's just like a monthly fee of like service fee. Like it's just like $0 energy bills do not exist, I guess, unless you're like maybe on an independent like microgrid you made in your backyard. But even then, I'm sure there's someone will get you.
Like technically you could, but like that is what's called grid defection, right? And that's like cord cutting. You obviously people have been doing this around TV and stuff, but like for the grid, it's pretty rare. And to have a solar and storage system alone without a gas generator, just solar and storage that you could disconnect from the grid would cost. It would cost like what some of these
don't believe when they say $0
energy
energy bills. That's a huge
huge
red flag. Correct. Where the reputable companies I just mentioned, they will never tell you that your bill will be $0. Right. They will break down for you exactly what your costs are. I mean, these are also the same companies that will like they turn people away if they're a bad fit. Like they have consultations that end in someone not getting a system. Locally,
maybe there's too many like trees over the roof, or the roof is facing mostly north. You will have that
CPS Energy locally will do free at-home energy efficiency audits. So that's a third-party person, if you're a CPS Energy customer, that you can get CPS to come in. They have no skin in the game, and they can straight up just tell you, like, yeah, your house is not a great candidate, like, or let's get your energy use as low as possible with other, new windows or new air conditioning or new insulation before you jump to like solar panels, because that will ultimately make your system more efficient and also less expensive if your energy use is already lower. So those are the kinds of things that like consumers need to be aware of, and that if you're dealing with someone who is honest, will know and understand. And if they're not willing to talk about ways to make your home more energy efficient as part of their like business model, that's also another indication that you might not be dealing with a company you can trust or knows what they're doing.
So, Sarah, I want you to do a little thought experiment with me here. So,
Okay.
a good friend of the family or an aunt or something like that comes to you and says, Sarah, I know you cover energy for the newspaper. I want to get solar at my house. First of all, would you tell them don't do it? And if you said you might want to consider it, what would you tell them? A close friend or a relative, what advice would you give them as they're considering solar at their home?
Yeah, well, there's a few things they can check themselves before they even like consider anything. And that's like, what direction does your roof face? Which sounds so simple, but I found numerous examples of folks with panels on north-facing roofs, which they will never get enough sun to make the cost of them like make sense.
To be clear, that's malpractice, right? If you're in the northern hemisphere, it should face south. There are some cases where they might face southwest or even west, because the west facing sun is obviously you're going to get more kind of at
for sure
sunset when it's still quite hot, but not north.
No, and it's incredible how many I've seen. And so like that is something you can check. Like you can go outside with a compass or with Google Maps and like get a sense of, am I facing the right direction? And then the next question is, how much surface area do I have on my roof? So, some people have funky old houses with like weird little, grooves and stuff. And like, you don't have a flat area, like it might make it more challenging. Or, I've seen people build like gazebos in their backyards or different, like you might need an alternative system. And those are things to think about. The next things you should be thinking about is just like your financial situation. Like, how much of this are you financing in general? Like, do you really, do you have an emergency fund? Do you have like all these like general, just like smart money things you need to be thinking of, because it's a very expensive commitment. And then kind of moving into those energy efficiency questions. I would never tell anyone like not to do it, but like you have to be smart about it. Solar is definitely a good technology. And I've met plenty of folks who have solar and battery and, have kept their power on when, Houston had its recent storm Beryl. There were a few examples of folks who came out and were like, yeah, I've been fine because I have a, battery storage system, and I was at least able to keep some of my lights on and my fridge. And, maybe they didn't have their AC running, but, they were able to like do some semblance of normal, right, while their neighbors were waiting.
And Sarah, to be clear, like a lot of them do have it hooked up. A lot of it will be critical circuits usually, but I think a lot of them these days are sizing them to be able to run the air conditioning. And there were stories. Your sort of sister publication, the Houston Chronicle, had a really good one on a couple different folks who had those systems and were letting their neighbors hook up extension cords so their food wouldn't rot. And
those stories are certainly out there. But those are people who also spent a lot of time teaching themselves how this stuff works. And that's kind of like the really hard part. There's someone else, I think, in the final part who just talked about like he finally got he has a system he loves, but the amount of work he had to put in to get there himself is just kind of absurd because he couldn't trust the folks in the industry, and there were no safeguards for him to be like, okay, this person has a license, or this person has what they need to have, and this person knows how to design a system, because it's kind of a many people have called it the wild west, and it makes it really difficult on the consumer, and it puts a lot on them to become a student of solar power, whereas ideally there wouldn't be such a barrier of entry to get a renewable resource that can be really beneficial both to individuals and to the grid as a whole at a time like we're experiencing unprecedented demand. So his frustrations were coming from the fact that like it shouldn't be this hard to get like trustworthy folks to sell you and install a system that's the right fit and costs and all those things.
So that's where I want to go to next. And I just want to, what are some, you've mentioned a couple of the policies. Maybe we can recap some of those, and if there's any others, add to them. I just want to, before I ask you that though, Sara, I just want to put this also in context for folks. So Texas right now, on a grid that has had a peak demand of 85,000 megawatts, has somewhere around 4,000 or so. It might be about 3,500, 4,000, somewhere in there, megawatts worth of distributed solar. And that's of all kinds. Some of that is commercial rooftop, some is residential. So that's like roughly 5%. California has about a 55,000 megawatt peak, has almost 20,000 megawatts of residential solar. Australia, similar amounts of sun to Texas. Of course, they would want north facing since they're southern hemisphere. But anyway, they're like, that's a 60,000 megawatt peak, and they've got about 20,000 megawatts. ERCOT, and I'll link to some of these things in the show notes, but ERCOT has some projections of solar that have us going to like 6,000 megawatts in the next 10 years. NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, thinks that Texas within 10 to 15 years will really be in more, I can't remember the exact numbers, but much more in that like 15 to even 20,000 megawatts worth of solar. So there's going to be big growth in this industry. And it is critically important. I can't emphasize it enough how important this series you put out is, because if the growth rates are like that, and if companies like what is the one that you specifically, is it Lumio or something like that?
Yes, Lumio. They are now bankrupt, but they were very prolific. And also some of the folks that were in that company have gone out and they've started other companies. So it's like, it's really a game of whack-a-mole. It's not just because the one company went bankrupt does not mean that the folks that were involved aren't still doing the same thing. Sometimes they'll go and sell in another state for a little bit, but they're just going where the market's hot. So if there's, if they're noticing an uptick again in Texas, they're going to be right back and, going to the same neighborhoods.
So this is my question. What if there's going to be growth in solar? Obviously, we all have an interest in making sure that nobody is victimized, taken advantage of, nobody of any socioeconomic status or geography or whatever variable, but certainly not people that are on a fixed income. A lot of times are veterans, are disabled, are not in great health. Like, there has to be consumer protection here. So, and obviously you're not a policymaker. The policymakers are going to do that, but you've covered some of this in the articles. You have some thoughts about this. Like, what are some of the things that the policymakers could do to, like you were describing, the gentleman who really struggled, to make it easier for folks who actually want to bring their own money into helping the grid be more reliable, who want resiliency from a storm? How do we protect them, make it easy, and make sure that there's not another 4-part series with people being taken advantage of?
I think there's a lot of states who we can look to for examples. Nevada has created like a whole investigative unit through their attorney general's office that will like really target problem companies and try to stop them before they get, to keep it rolling. And that, a lot of these states have responded because they've seen the same things we've seen. It's just for whatever reasons, like Texas has not been aggressive in handling the issue. A lot of the folks I spoke with, they're not hearing back from the attorney general at all. So I think that could be a key component, is making sure that their infrastructure is there, that there are, the bodies, people, resources needed to like be investigating these issues and like bringing litigation forward. Minnesota's attorney general, for example, has an ongoing case focusing specifically on the dealer fee conversation we had about how like this financing should be handled and how could it be made more transparent. And, I'm interested to see where those lawsuits go. A lot of those states also have licensing requirements. So they will require, they might, like Craig, who we're talking about, the local community college, he teaches his students to something called
NABCEP. It's NABCEP.
National.
Yeah.
It's a long acronym, but
I got you. It's North American Board Certified Energy Practitioner. And it's been around. It's been around a long time. Anybody in the solar industry really should have that. So it's a great thing for consumers. Ask somebody, if you're talking to them about a solar system, do you have a NABCEP certification?
And make sure they individually have it, because just because the CEO has it, it doesn't really help you if that's not the person actually installing your panels. And I've seen that too as like a kind of a obfuscation of like, oh yeah, we have NABCEP, don't worry about it. And it's like, you know, their CEO took one course a year ago, and it's not the actual folks on the ground. But a lot of the licensing some states have, either they'll take the NABCEP as like, you show that you have NABCEP, you get your state license, or they modeled the test after the NABCEP test. Others have added like a sort of like a category under being an electrician, because that's the issue in Texas is like, yes, a certified electrician is required, but you don't necessarily learn how to install solar panels like when you're getting your electrician apprenticeship. You know how to check like the fuse box stuff and make sure the connection to the grid is okay. That doesn't mean the panels up top are installed correctly or designed right. So I think that I don't know that lawmakers are going to go that far, but if I could wave my magic wand, I think some of that stuff would be really helpful. One thing I have heard that is being considered in Texas that I think is also a good step is some kind of way to track the door-to-door salespeople. So Florida and California both have examples of this, where there's a background check involved. I think there's some kind of fee, and you're either doing it with the state or with the county, but there's some, like, you have a permit essentially to sell door-to-door. And you may not have to take a test that proves you know what you're talking about with solar, but at least there's like a track record of you. And we're also seeing the industry try to roll out something similar through a third-party company. Their name is Recheck. They're trying to partner up with some of the fintech companies that are providing the loans that is kind of led to a lot of these solar deals across the country. And they're basically saying potentially they want to see a future where a financer will not allow a door-to-door salesman to use their financing platform if they are not on this Recheck platform. That will give them sort of a paper trail, won't let them jump company to company easily without having to answer for, the 5 complaints they got on one street or, et cetera. So those are things that I think could really help.
There's the certificate of completion. We already covered that. You don't need to say it again. But I would just
exactly.
If anybody's making a list, that one should be on there. Nobody gets paid till it passes inspection, right?
Yeah, and or at least like some doesn't complete payment. I understand there's like the industry side will make the argument of like, well, how do you expect us to buy the supplies or like be able to afford to install it? But I think there is like a workable solution. Some middle ground. Sure. Because one of the other complications, and I think you and I have talked about this before off pod, is that in Texas, roofing also isn't regulated.
Right.
So, which is a whole other can of worms. But in some states, they're able to sort of build off their existing roofing regulations to just add on solar. Well, we don't have that to work from. So, like, how do we effectively make something without having to like create a whole new entity that I can't imagine lawmakers are super eager to do. Whole other can of worms, but like when we're focusing on this topic, I think there's a way to be realistic about what we can achieve quickly, because as you said, like growth is probably coming. It's also needed. So like we're dealing with such crazy demand growth that I think most experts like yourself agree we need every megawatt we can get. So how do we ensure that folks are getting systems that don't only help the grid, but also will help them and aren't part of that 24% in Austin whose systems are failing their first inspection and then, or even more inspections and never getting on. I think that's sort of what I hope lawmakers are considering as they head into session. The consumer bill that I'm waiting to be filed has not been filed yet. The only thing that's been filed thus far that touches directly on this issue would require the Public Utility Council to create some kind of consumer guide, which I think would also be helpful, but it's not intended to be like there's no penalties or enforcement. It's really just a place where at least people in the state could go for an authority of information to explain some of the things we just talked about, as far as like what red flags and what's normal, and being able to find that on a state website rather than a 4-part investigative series written by me.
Just something else I'll mention before we end. I also would encourage folks who are considering solar to look at the different trade associations like the Texas Solar Energy Society, Solar Energy Industries Association, Texas Solar and Storage Association, any of them, and kind of look at their membership. I am not going to warranty that anybody's work is going to be great, but I would encourage folks to not go with the door-to-door folks and look at the companies that are actively involved in associations that are trying to weed out the bad actors.
Right. And if nothing else, like those folks also have some accountability metrics. So like if you do find that they're not being honest, you have someone you can tell who may actually do something about it, like at least kick them off that list or, warn other people. But it's definitely a good starting point where you're going to cut out a lot of the folks who have bad intentions. It's a good place,
Exactly.
A good place to start for sure.
Exactly. Sara, I can't say enough good things about the series. I hope anybody who is considering solar or knows anybody who's considering solar reads through it. Better to be an informed customer and know that information up front than to get burned. I hope folks will read it who aren't considering solar. It's just a great piece of investigative journalism. Very appreciative for what you've done. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish that I would have, or anything else you want to say?
I'm sure I'll think of something later. I will. I don't know how the timing of all of this, but we do next, February 5th, for subscribers. We're doing like a Zoom Q&A with me and hopefully with some other panelists. We're still working out the details. But that might, if you're a subscriber, that's something to look out for. But if you have questions, you can email me. I might not, I get a lot of, that is my new unofficial job, is like solar advice giver. I get a lot of like unsolicited, like, does this seem like a scam? Or, and I do my best to get back to folks eventually. Forgive me if I don't get back to you right away. But usually I at least try to give them some guidance of where to go. So feel free to reach out or listen to that Q&A that's coming out in early February.
We'll put in the show notes where folks can find you, the website, the links to all of your articles. We'll put your Twitter handle. Sara is also a great follow on Twitter for grid-related updates and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know whether this will come out before February 5th. If it's after, we can maybe still put a link to it that people can see it
worries.
And they can find future events. But
yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you, Sara. Appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please like, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.